And it's understood that these incidents
good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world right now. Thank you for joining the MacArthur Memorial for this special presentation. 2020 marks the 75th anniversary of the use of the atomic bombs and the end of World War II. Like many of you, we were looking forward to gathering together to discuss, debate, and commemorate some of these significant events. For many of us, these events were very important in the lives of our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and so on. But while we cannot meet right now in person, it is a privilege to be joined by all of you, whether you are just down the road or on the other side of the world. World War II was a global war, and I think there's something very fitting about all of us being able to come together over these virtual platforms to commemorate these events. Special thanks tonight to the General Douglas MacArthur Foundation for sponsoring this event. If you'd like to learn more about the foundation or the MacArthur Memorial, please visit our website, www.macarthurmemorial.org.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the MacArthur Memorial. Tonight's program with Richard Frank was supposed to be here in the MacArthur Theater, but because of the situation around the world, we've had to go to a virtual platform, and we're glad that you joined us. Richard Frank has been around for about 30 years now as one of the great military historians of the United States, starting with his really seminal work on Guadalcanal, and then 1999's Downfall, 2007's MacArthur, and his latest book, Tower of Skulls by W.W. Norton, which has just come out. Tonight we're going to go back to that Downfall book, though, and this is about the end of World War II. Now, over the past 20 years since that book came out, Dr. Frank has done a great deal of work that adds a lot to it. So you're going to hear a lot of things tonight that weren't actually in that book, and we hope you're going to find it just as interesting as we did. We thank you for coming. We hope you'll join us again, but tonight, Richard Frank.
I wish to talk to you about the end of what I believe we should call the Asia-Pacific War, not the Pacific War. That title choice is not some modest adjustment of wording, but underscores a fundamental change in the concept of this whole episode in American and world history. If we recognize the event as the Asia-Pacific War, then we can understand the ending of the war was truly a miraculous deliverance from a titanic tragedy, one of the greatest tragedies in human history. To do this, I must talk specifically about the dead. Not some of the dead, but all of the dead. And I ask you to follow me in treating all the dead as sharing a common humanity. The Asia-Pacific War commenced in July 1937, when Japan attacked China and the Chinese mounted sustained armed resistance to that aggression. It ended 8 years and 2 months later in August of 1945. It was a war of an immense scale, now seldom recognized. Although the war began in China, it would expand west to India, south to what is now Indonesia, east to the Hawaiian Islands with a light brush against the U.S. West Coast, north to the Aleutian Islands, and the northeast corner of Asia. Within that span, in 1937, lived over 1 billion people, at least half the population of the world, which was then about 2.3 billion. At the zenith of Japan's imperial conquests, there were about 516 million people within Japan's control, more than 20% of the world population. At the height of Hitler's conquests, he had under his heel about 360 million people, about 14% of the world's population. More than midway through the Asia-Pacific War, Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor and her allies in December 1941. We've called that part of the war the Pacific War, but it really was only a subpart of the much larger Asia-Pacific War. And two words define the basic difference between the Asia-Pacific and Pacific War. Those words are the dead. By conservative counting, at least 25 million people perished in the Asia-Pacific War. About 6 million of these were combatants, soldiers, sailors, airmen, and about 5 of 6 of those were Chinese or Japanese. That leaves 19 million non-combatant dead. So how many of these non-combatant deaths were Japanese? Well, using a generous definition of what a Japanese non-combatant was, particularly in 1945, and using the higher end estimates about total Japanese casualties, you can get to 1 million or about 1.2 million Japanese non-combatant deaths at the outside. This math tells you that for every Japanese non-combatant who died, between 17 and 18 other non-combatants died. They were overwhelmingly other Asians, and about 12 of them were Chinese. By the summer of 1945, the largest part of the 17 or 18 million non-combatants who were not Japanese were dead. And they were dying at a rate, not counting Japanese again, were dying at a rate of between 8,000 and 14,000 every single day. That's about 240,000 to 400,000 a month. By contrast, the Pacific War was essentially the clash between the United States and Japan across the Pacific, which only touched peripherally a number of other nations and peoples. It produced at the utmost 3 to 3.5 million dead, although that's probably a serious overstatement, which would be about 12 to 15% of the total dead in the Asia-Pacific War. And the Pacific War framework excludes the death toll of almost all those 17 or 18 million non-combatant dead who are not Japanese, and perversely makes it appear as though the overwhelming majority of the non-combatant dead were Japanese. With these numbers in mind, by the summer of 1945, the Asia-Pacific War ranked high on any scroll of history's greatest human tragedies. The tragedy increased each day, and by far the greatest impact of that tragedy was borne by people who were not Japanese. Now, before we get into the specifics of what happened in 1945, 75 years ago, we need to have in mind, I think, two critical elements in context. The first, we have to remember that the power to decide when and how the war would end rested in Tokyo. But when we look at the record statecraft for Japan's leadership in 1945, we should be sobered, very sobered. Japan's leadership had managed to array against Japan the world's most populous nation, China, the world's greatest empire, the British Empire and Commonwealth, and the world's most advanced industrial powerhouse, the United States. These three nations alone had about 16 times the population of Japan and economies on a similar scale. Japan could look to one important ally for at least 4 months, Nazi Germany. This regime is usually deemed to be the epitome of evil in modern history, if not all history. It had been pursuing a program of world conquest under a race-based ideology that would have reduced the Japanese to slaves at best, and perhaps exterminated them all. A key part of the explanation for how Japan found herself in such a situation rests in the astonishingly dysfunctional nature of Japan's political and military decision-making system. Now, I don't have time now to go to an extended discussion of this dysfunctional system, but one especially relevant feature needs to be emphasized. Prime Minister Kentaro Suzuki headed the legal government of Japan from April 1945 until the war's end. The real power within that government was exercised by an inner cabinet called by its membership the Big Six. This body comprised 3 current or former admirals and 2 active duty generals. There was just one civilian, the foreign minister. Due to Japanese cultural norms, the Big Six could only implement a policy by completely unanimous agreement. Any vote less than 6-0 would stymie any policy, and the military held 5 of those 6 votes. So what was Japan actually seeking as 1945 began? But when they took stock, they recognized that their military situation was indeed dire. The balance was seriously, in fact, almost hopelessly, it seemed, against them. But surrender was an anathema. And they believed they had identified a path to bring the war to an end that they could abide. It was a sequenced two-step military and political and diplomatic strategy. They called it Ketsugo, or Operation Decisive. As they conceived the strategy, the military component was entirely dominant, because without some military success, they believed they would have no room for negotiation to bring the war to a conclusion that they could abide. The fundamental principle of Japan's military strategy in Ketsugo was that however much material power the Americans had, American morale was brittle. And the first phase of Ketsugo aimed to break American will with either a military victory or at least a very graphic demonstration of how costly fighting would be through the home islands. Then and only then, the Japanese could apprise the situation and determine how far they could press in a negotiated peace. Their detailed plans were chillingly prescient. They depended on the impatient Americans to come and invade the Japanese home islands and not simply stand off and blockade and bombard in the war. And the Japanese correctly identified where the initial landing would occur, in southern Kyushu, the southernmost home island. They deduced that the Americans would hold Okinawa by the midsummer, and that American operational policy was always to mount major operations within range of land-based American fighter aircraft. If the Americans held Okinawa, then the place they would go would be southern Kyushu. And they also knew that the U.S. would be coming primarily for airbase sites to support further landing operations. Any glance at a topographical map of southern Kyushu immediately will disclose the most simple-minded person the obvious landing places if you're seeking to build air bases. And then from January to what proved to be the end of the war, in August, the Japanese mounted a huge mobilization of ground and air forces to meet the Kyushu landing and defeat it, or to make it such a huge bloodbath that the U.S. would negotiate an end of the war to the satisfaction of Japan's leaders. As to the scale of this mobilization, the essential data points are as follows. At the beginning of the year, the Japanese had just one field division, perhaps approximately 15 to 20,000 men, to defend the entire island of Kyushu, and the island housed a few hundred aircraft. By August, there were 14 Japanese field divisions and 10 brigades, mostly in the southern part of Kyushu, and a total manpower between 700 and 900,000 men to meet an American assault force of 380,000 men. The aircraft ready for the defense of Kyushu numbered over 10,000, and half of them had been pre-designated as kamikazes, or suicide planes, with a special target of American troop transports. Now, what was the U.S. seeking as 1945 began? President Franklin Roosevelt had set the American war aim as the unconditional surrender of the Axis powers in January 1943. For our purposes, the important point is that the planners working up the detailed blueprints for the occupation and reform of Japan based their ambitious goals on the fact that unconditional surrender would give the United States legal authority to go far beyond what was normally allowed by the international law of military occupation in the reform program. So unconditional surrender, as it would practically be applied against Japan, was a program essentially for peace, not simply a slogan for victory. The duty to devise military strategy to achieve unconditional surrender fell to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They divided sharply over the issue of time versus casualties. The Army, led by General George C. Marshall, believed that time was the critical element to maintain support of the American people for unconditional surrender. The Army advocated an invasion of the Japanese home islands as the swiftest way to end the war. The Navy was led by Admiral Ernest J. King, and the Navy had literally studied war with Japan for decades. And a fundamental conclusion from all that study was that an invasion of the Japanese home islands would produce politically totally unacceptable casualties. Therefore, the Navy advocated a strategy of bombardment by air and sea and mainly blockade. It cannot be emphasized enough that blockade aimed to ultimately force the surrender of Japan by starving to death millions of Japanese, mostly non-combatants. Given the comparatively much lesser capacity to kill with bombardment, even with the atomic weapons that were available at that time, which were puny compared to what came later, blockade was effectively the most ruthless American strategy that we contemplated in the war with Japan in 1945. In April 1945, the Joint Chiefs adopted a policy paper setting forth both their strategy and the reasoning behind it. The overall vision was that the U.S. would continue an already ongoing program of bombardment and blockade, which still was in its early stages. And then in November, this would be merged with a two-phase initial invasion of the Japanese home islands. The first phase of this invasion was called Operation Olympic, and it would target southern Kyushu with a projected date of the 1st of November 1944. This, of course, is exactly what the Japanese anticipated. The purpose of Olympic was to seize sea and primarily air bases to support a second invasion, Operation Coronet, tentatively set for the 1st of March 1946. Coronet was aimed at the Tokyo area. In setting forth a rationale for this plan, the Joint Chiefs noted there were two manifest obstacles to achieving and to securing unconditional surrender. The first was that no Japanese government had ever surrendered to a foreign power in the history of Japan. Now, the Joint Chiefs didn't give a specific number, but by Japanese count, that was 2,600 years. The second obstacle was that no Japanese unit had ever surrendered in any skirmish, battle, or campaign of the war. Therefore, the Joint Chiefs concluded that there was no guarantee that the U.S. could obtain a surrender of the Japanese government, or that the Japanese armed forces would entirely comply with the surrender order from the Japanese government. The U.S. would then face the prospect of defeating what was then estimated to be about 5 million Japanese under arms in the home islands, on the Asian continent, and in the Pacific, with such assistance as our allies could provide for a period that was impossible to project. It cannot be emphasized enough that what the Joint Chiefs are identifying here is the true American nightmare in 1945. It was not simply the invasion of Japan. It was the prospect of no organized surrender of the Japanese government and armed forces. Now, a very costly battle had commenced on Iwo Jima in February 1945 that officially ended on March 16th. For the first time in the war, U.S. casualties in dead and wounded exceeded Japanese casualties in Iwo Jima. There were almost 7,000 dead Americans. This was followed by a landing on Okinawa on the 1st of April. President Franklin Roosevelt died on the 12th of April, and Harry S. Truman became president. Part of Truman's daily briefing included updates from Okinawa. As the campaign bogged down and American casualties grew alarmingly, as one of his staff officers said, President Truman was perturbed over U.S. losses. Truman called a meeting in the White House on June 18, 1945, to review the downfall plan. He said his primary consideration was casualties. During the meeting, he expressed concern that we might be facing an Okinawa, as he put it, from one end of Japan to another. He uneasily gave assent to Olympic, would not give even tentative approval to Coronet, the invasion around Tokyo. His approval of Olympic rested primarily on the fact that every single other individual at that meeting urged the president to approve Olympic. And secondly, he was presented with a case in which the U.S. would have overpowering numerical superiority when the Olympic landing occurred. Meanwhile, in June in Tokyo, there was an imperial conference, which is one before the emperor. It took place on June 8th. That conclave approved a program that called for fighting on to the end without any thought of surrender. Afterwards, Hirohito's principal advisor, Lord Kido, presented to the emperor a memo calling for his intervention, the emperor's intervention, on the diplomatic front. The Big Six, the inner cabinet that really controlled Japan, had authorized a cautious diplomatic approach to the Soviet Union in May. This approach, however, was limited to trying to keep the Soviets out of the war and even to attempt to get the Soviets to agree to become Japan's ally against the United States. Now, Kido proposed an approach to the Soviets should focus on seeking Soviet mediation to end the war, not to deliver a surrender note. Akito's sketch of the terms really evoked the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I. Japan might have to give up territory and endure a period of disarmament, but there would be no occupation of Japan. The imperial system and Hirohito's seat on the throne would be secure. The emperor met with the Big Six on June 22nd and secured their ostensible agreement to this scheme. The problem was that to make this scheme work, the Japanese would have to first make concessions to the Soviets to secure their role as a mediator. And then second, Japan would have to present specific terms to end the war. Post-war, the members of the Big Six conceded they never devised concessions to secure Soviet mediation, and much less did they get to any terms to end the war prior to Hiroshima. This takes us to the fact that Allied, primarily American, codebreakers had massively penetrated Japanese coded diplomatic and military traffic. These intercepts were arranged in a daily newsletter, two daily newsletters, which were presented to senior American officials with President Truman at the top of the list. One of them covered diplomatic intercepts, and the other covered military developments. Now, the diplomatic summary showed that there were a number of Japanese diplomats and military and naval attachés in Western Europe, in places like Sweden, Switzerland, and the Vatican, who had presented themselves as what I would call peace entrepreneurs, claiming they were acting on behalf of the Japanese government to secure an end to the war. But the intercepted cables made it clear that none of these peace entrepreneurs carried the official sanction of the Japanese government. Accordingly, Mr. Truman and his lieutenants understood that these incidents carried no significance. Later arguments that these episodes demonstrated the government of Japan was actively seeking peace through multiple parties are simply false. And just as importantly, Mr. Truman and his lieutenants knew they were false at the time. The sole Japanese official outside Japan who did enjoy official sanction was the Japanese ambassador to Moscow, a gentleman named Naotaki Sato. When you arrange Sato's cables in his exchange with the Japanese foreign minister, Shigenori Togo, you find that Sato served, as a lawyer would put it, as the prosecuting attorney on behalf of the Truman administration, unmasking with a searing cross-examination with scathing words the utter pathos and haplessness of an initiative that was never really supported by the Big Six. In one memorable passage, Sato dismissed one cable from Togo, trying to address the concessions that Japan would have to make to secure Soviet mediation as, quote, pretty little phrases devoid of any connection with reality, end of quote. Sato also became angrily frustrated when he kept explaining that the Soviets would not deem the initiative to be serious unless Japan specified terms for ending the war. And Togo could not provide terms because the Big Six never devised terms. In exasperation, Sato shot off a cable saying that the best Japan could hope for was unconditional surrender, modified only to the extent that the imperial system would be preserved. The editors of the diplomatic summaries, which were being presented to Mr. Truman and other members of the government, recognized immediately the great importance of this message. And Togo's reply was a complete rejection of Sato's formula. There was not even a comment that a promise to preserve the imperial institution would be a helpful step. There was, in fact, no hint there were any terms acceptable to the Japanese government in July 1945. The editors were at pains to make the significance of this exchange clear to Truman and others in that summary. It confirmed that just as the Japanese had never devised concessions to secure Soviet mediation, likewise they could not agree on terms to end the war. And though at first Truman had expressed optimism that this initiative signaled some serious Japanese effort to end the war, as he went through the cumulative cables between Sato and Togo, it revealed all too clearly that Japan remained far from peace. Now, overlapping this news was something far worse. Radio intelligence revealed that the last 2 weeks of July and the early days of August, the stupendous Japanese buildup on Kyushu of forces on the ground and in the air to meet the Olympic landings. Here you can take this in with your own eyes on this slide. On the left is what the original plan envisioned, an overpowering U.S. landing force heavily outnumbering the defenders. On the right is the actual situation by August. U.S. forces about to launch into a bloodbath. On July 27th, the daily intelligence brief presented to President Truman and every other senior American leader contained an appendix with an analysis of both the diplomatic and military intercepts and what they showed. And that analysis concluded that Japan was nowhere near peace, that the Japanese militarists were firmly in control, and they were banking on defeating or inflicting huge loss on Olympic. And the military intercepts demonstrated that Olympic looked like it was indeed heading for a bloodbath. So how does the war actually end? Well, the B-29 Enola Gay dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima on the morning of August 6th. Tokyo received word that something truly terrible had occurred in Hiroshima and then monitored President Truman's public announcement that it had been struck by an atomic bomb. The reaction to this news is highly significant. Japan had an atomic bomb program that did not produce a bomb, but it did educate the Japanese leadership that producing fissionable material, which is the stuff that makes an atomic bomb, was a stupendously difficult task. And hence the immediate response of the Imperial Army to the news was to say they would not concede the Americans had an atomic bomb until there was an investigation. The reaction of the Imperial Navy was far more ominous. The Imperial Navy said, well, maybe the Americans have one bomb, but they can't have that many bombs. They won't be that powerful, or perhaps they'll be dissuaded by international pressure from using them. In plain terms, Hiroshima did not convince the leadership of the Japanese government that the U.S. had more than one bomb, much less an arsenal of powerful atomic bombs. This shows how no offer of a demonstration of one bomb would have worked to convince the Japanese leaders to end the war. But on the afternoon of August 8th, Emperor Hirohito acted in what was the key event of the Japanese surrender. Here we must pause for a moment to take in 2 points. To actually end the war, Japan had to take 2 steps, not 1 step, 2 steps. First, someone with legitimate authority had to decide that Japan as a nation state would surrender. But that alone would not end the war. The second step required that Japan's armed forces comply with the surrender, the fighting to actually halt. So shortly after the war, Foreign Minister Togo reported that he had met with the emperor on the afternoon of August 8th, and that the emperor at that moment had announced that the war must end. Now, this is after Hiroshima. It is before the intervention of the Soviet Union in the war during the night of the August 8th, August 9th, and before Nagasaki on the 9th. I treated this very cautiously when I did my book about the end of the war, because I thought there was not sufficient supporting evidence for Togo's account. And it was also necessary to be wary about post-war Japanese accounts, as the old guard was trying to maintain the imperial institution and Hirohito's seat on the throne. Now, however, important new work by a Japanese historian that will be published shortly provides not only confirmation of Togo's account, but stunning new revelations about the background to the meeting. So now I am convinced that Emperor Hirohito himself had decided the war must end on the afternoon of August 8th. And while Hiroshima, the prospect that the U.S. had more than one atomic bomb, now stands as the proximate cause of the emperor's decision, the emperor's contemporaneous accounts and statements over the next several days provide some further reasons behind his actions. He spoke repeatedly of 3 things. The first was that he'd lost faith. He had lost faith in Ketsugo. Note that this point struck a decisive blow right at the heart of the argument of the militarists for continuing the war. Second, he spoke of the increasing destruction of conventional, now atomic bombing. But third, he spoke of what he called the domestic situation. This was a euphemism that reflected the rising anxiety of many Japanese senior leaders, including the emperor, that Japanese people were moving towards a revolutionary state. This was not immediately in the offing in August, but it was something that was looming up on the horizon probably in the fall. and was affecting their perception of their situation. What Hirohito did not dwell upon was Soviet intervention. And now we have confirmation of his stated decision on August 8th to end the war. We know what effect Soviet intervention, in fact, had on his decision. Now, this is not to say that Soviet intervention had no role at all, for it is important as to the second step, the compliance of Japan's armed forces with the surrender. General Torishio Kawabe was effectively the number 2 officer on the operational side of the Imperial Army, and he was keeping a contemporary daily diary. In this diary, he records that after he learned of the Emperor's decision to end the war and Japan must surrender, another very senior general at Imperial General Headquarters came to him and said, "I don't think the overseas commanders are going to comply even with an order from the Emperor to surrender." And Kawabe wrote in his diary that he agreed. He didn't think they would comply either. And right on cue, cables arrived from 2 of the 3 major overseas commanders, one in China and the other in effectively what was Southeast Asia or the Pacific. And both of those commanders announced that they would not comply with even this Emperor's surrender order. Now, a coup d'etat was attempted by some radical middle grade officers in Tokyo on the night of August 14th, 15th. They seized the grounds of the Imperial Palace for a time, for a while before having the uprising crushed. Much ink has been shed about this episode, but it really had very small chance of success. This brings us back to the Emperor. At the time he announced his decision to the Big Six that Japan must surrender in the early hours of August 10th, he directed that 2 proclamations be prepared in his name. One would be his personal broadcast to the Japanese people on August 15th, announcing the end of the war. By the way, in that proclamation, he never used the word surrender. This was pre-recorded on a photograph record and was in fact a special target of the coup attempt, although they never located it. And the Emperor recognized that he needed to take further action to secure the armed forces' compliance with his decision to surrender. He had drafted an imperial rescript, or proclamation, directed at the armed forces. In the face of evidence of non-compliance, this proclamation was issued to the armed forces on August 17th. And while the Emperor's broadcast on August 15th mentioned the atomic bomb, but did not mention Soviet intervention, the proclamation issued to the armed forces on August 17th spoke of Soviet intervention, but not the atomic bomb. There was a reason for this difference. Atomic bombs both were not understood by the overseas commanders, and furthermore, there was no reasonable target for the U.S. to use an atomic bomb in areas occupied by Japan, populated by people the U.S. was trying to liberate. On the other hand, Soviet intervention did provide a real and understandable menace to the Japanese overseas commanders. So with the help of imperial princes that the emperor dispatched to express his firm will to end the war, he managed to secure compliance of these overseas commanders, and the fighting end of the war ended. Now, one further point about the Asia-Pacific War that you should keep in mind. I mentioned earlier that literally half the population of the world lived in that area. Well, that area would go from an area predominated by colonialism to now one of the leading areas of the world with at least 19 independent nations. And the path of all those 19 nations to independence is directly related to these events between 37 and 45. This is not distant history. It is part of the world we live in today. And finally, the Asia-Pacific War ended in the development of and the first testing and use of nuclear weapons. That event alone marked a turning point in human history that even the war in Europe did not equal. Let me finish by taking us back to where we began. This is the title image. Behind the wording was itself another image, and this is that image. When you saw this, I'm sure most of you assumed that this was an image of Hiroshima or Nagasaki, or maybe Tokyo after a fire raid. This is actually an image of Manila after a horrific battle in which Japanese forces killed tens of thousands of Filipinos, the number usually given is 100,000, which is more deaths than were caused by the Nagasaki atomic bomb. This was in February 1945. This image is a reminder of what the Asia-Pacific War was, one of the most titanic tragedies in human history. And we must never forget just how contingent the end of the war was. It took an almost unprecedented action by Emperor Hirohito to compel the Japanese government to surrender, a decision that government never made on its own, and we cannot know whether that government ever would have agreed to surrender. And even after that government complied with the emperor's decision, neither that government nor the emperor could be sure that Japan's armed forces would comply. And the evidence shows just how close run the thing was, the compliance of the Japanese armed forces was with that surrender. And so ended one of the most titanic tragedies in human history in what was seen by those who lived there at that time as a miraculous deliverance. Thank you.
Hey, Rich, how are you doing?
Very well, thank you.
That was another great talk. Amazing that after 75 years, so much new things still keep coming to light.
It is amazing, isn't it? And I apologize for the fact that I didn't have my technical equipment up right, and I'm sort of looking off into space, whatever, and directly into the camera, or whatever.
We found that very dramatic, as when you got to a very great point, you always look straight at the camera. So we were very amazed by that. We do have some questions that are coming in from people. If you're ready, can I go ahead and start?
Most certainly.
Great. The first one is from John Shively, and he's asking how many atomic bombs were available in 1945 for use as a weapon?
That's a very good question. In August of 1945, we had the uranium bomb, which was the one that was used at Hiroshima. And then we had a series of plutonium bombs. The Nagasaki bomb was a plutonium bomb. We had a third bomb that potentially would have been usable by about roughly the 19th of August if everything had sort of marched along at a rapid pace. Interestingly enough, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we now know George C. Marshall, the Chief of Staff of the Army, dispatched one of his staff officers to talk to one of the officials at the Manhattan Project, which was producing the atomic bombs. And the transcript of that conversation is fascinating because what it shows is that the staff officer said that General Marshall thought that Japan would either surrender as a nation after 2 bombs on cities or no number of bombs on Japanese cities will compel the Japanese government to surrender. And therefore, Marshall had sent this officer to ask about what we now call the tactical use of further nuclear bomb production to support the invasion of Japan. And we know further from the context that by this point, about August 9th, 10th of 1945, they're looking at this horrendous picture of this Japanese buildup on southern Kyushu. And so that whole operation downfall is very much in question. So that's why Marshall is looking into tactical use of weapons or whatever here. We also know, based on that conversation, that the gentleman from the Manhattan Project was saying that there would be another 7 bombs available by the 1st of November. That's to say, after Nagasaki, 7 more bombs would be available by the 1st of November. 1st of November, yes.
Thank you. We have another question from Mr. Jean-Luc Schilling. He's over in France right now. And he wants to know, when dropping the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, was Truman's first and main goal to obtain an unconditional Japanese surrender or to intimidate Stalin with indeed some kind of objective complicity from the Japanese government, which was terrified of a Soviet military invasion?
That gets to really a central sort of perennial question that's now being asked. Let me approach it this way. One of the most important things we now know that we didn't know literally for decades thereafter was that Mr. Truman and his government basically forfeited the very best evidence they had about their decision-making process. which is to say all that intelligence information that was flowing to them. And now that we have that information available, we can see that anyone who was looking at that, and that's what I tried to do in Downfall, is I tried to set it up so a reader was like looking over Mr. Truman's shoulder at what he's seeing. What would you think if you're seeing this information? And the answer was, the Japanese are not close to surrender, and you're looking at this horrifying portrait of what you thought was going to be a doable thing to go to southern Kyushu in November is now looking like a guaranteed bloodbath, whatever here. So at that point, the principal, fundamental reason why the bombs were used was to end the war as rapidly as possible, save American. And I would add, Mr. Truman made some comments also saying he was mindful of Japanese lives. He was not gleeful by any means about the death of Japanese. Now, there's a historian that a mentor, a good friend of mine, Barton Bernstein, and he's phrased the Soviet element of this. He says, this is the bonus. They would have dropped those bombs regardless of whether the Soviet Union existed or not, whatever here. But in the context of what was happening in 1945, we're going to drop the bombs anyway. And oh, by the way, this may help us diplomatically with the Soviet Union. But it was not a fundamental driving reason for dropping the bombs. In fact, I find it hard to believe that anyone who conceivably could have been president at that point in August of 1945, and you're looking at this spectrum from basically James Burns and to Henry Wallace, looking at the same evidence that Truman was looking at, would not have made the same decision to go ahead and use the bombs. I mean, it's absolutely horrendous event. And in retrospect, we can say, could he, would have, should have, preferred, whatever. But at the moment of time, to end the war, to stop the bloodletting, and we can get more into that as I talked about. You have to understand that this war was not just simply a question of deaths of Japanese or Japanese non-combatants. It's a horrendous bloodbath all across Asia.
Wow. Wow. Thank you. Thank you. We also have another question from Peter Dunn. He's down in Australia tonight. Who told General MacArthur about the upcoming first atomic bomb to be dropped on Japan, and what date was that? Like how close to the event itself did MacArthur find out about this?
Well, let me answer it this way. First of all, Admiral Nimitz, who was the other senior commander of the Pacific, he was in charge of the forces there in the Mariana Islands, which were where the bases were for the B-29. So Nimitz was briefed on that and what had to be done with respect to getting the bases ready for the bombs early in 1945. General MacArthur had no need to know. General MacArthur wouldn't have told you that, but that was in fact the way the rest of the government looked at it. And he was not briefed on it until very, very late in the process. I've forgotten the exact date, but I think we're into August of 1945 before he's finally told about it or whatever here. So that was how close held that information was. And that sort of segues into something else. One of the other things you have to understand about the atomic bombs was that pervasive in all the discussion and all the back and forth about this was there was no complete confidence the bombs would work, or that more than one bomb might be a dud or whatever here. This is a very, very important issue with respect to consideration of bombs. I mean, it had never been done before, right? So there was no guarantee. It's a very complex process to fission more material and to make a bomb and have the bomb work. Very complex issues. So everyone was right to the end until we tested in July. There was no confidence at the top levels that for sure this weapon was going to work. And famously, President Roosevelt and President Truman's chief of staff, William Leahy, kept insisting it would never work because he was an expert in explosives. He kept saying that it ain't going to work over there. So no one was counting on the bombs absolutely working until you got very, very late in the process. And even afterwards, I mentioned that discussion with the Manhattan official. And the only safety issue they talked about there was not potential exposure of American troops to radiation from bombs. It was, what do you do if you drop one of these bombs and it does not go off? You tell everybody to walk very softly across the soil of Japan? Or what do you do to deal with the prospect that there's this dud atomic bomb sitting where we want to go?
Excellent. Thank you. We have another one that's coming in. Do we know what the total count of casualties of the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki together? I think you answered that when you talked about the Battle of Manila, but do you have an exact number?
it's an important and critical question. It's one for which there's never been an absolutely convincing total answer. The problem basically goes to 2 points. The first of which was that we really don't know with complete certainty how many human beings were in Hiroshima or Nagasaki on the day the bombs were dropped. We have ration numbers for how many people were drawing food in those two cities on those dates, but there's an argument that there was a substantially larger number of people who were there just who'd come into the city on that day. And secondly, the problem was that after the war, when the first attempts were made to sort of do a count of the survivors early in, like as early as 1950, the problem was there was already in Japan a stigma attached to individuals who'd been in Hiroshima or Nagasaki, that they were impure, unclean. And consequently, people were not necessarily forthright in reporting that they had been present and were in fact a survivor of the bombs. So I've worked on this quite a bit. Historian John Dower, who wrote an excellent book about the occupation of Japan and also other issues. And he and I actually are remarkably close together, I think, given the problems here. I said in Downfall that I thought the total number of Japanese who died from American bombing, both conventional and nuclear, was about 410,000, of which about 210,000 were casualties immediate or latent from atomic bombs. Dower did basically the same exercise, and his total was 430,000 dead. So we were within 5% of each other. And the difference was not really over the atomic bombs, it was over casualties in Tokyo, over here. Now, Dower does say 210,000 deaths from atomic bombs plus some, but he didn't give any number or whatever here. And that's kind of sort of what I view as the reasonable range about that. I mean, it's a horrific number, but you have to understand that the total number of Japanese non-combatant deaths was probably, as I said, about 1 million to 1.2 million. And Dower also, in his book on the occupation of Japan, points out that the Soviet Union, when it intervened in the war in August of 45, captured between 1.6 and 1.7 million Japanese nationals on the Asian continent, primarily in Manchuria and North Korea. And when the repatriation process was done, the Japanese had found that there were only 1.2 million accounted for, which is like 400,000 or 500,000 Japanese who basically died or disappeared in Soviet captivity.
Wow.
We know from Soviet archival documents that later came out that about 61,000, 62,000 of those were military personnel, which tells you by math alone that basically Soviet intervention and the holding of those Japanese in captivity killed between roughly 340 to 440,000 Japanese non-combatants, which is more than the atomic bombs killed. And one of the things that aggravates me in these debates is that people who talk about Soviet intervention always omit the Japanese non-combatants who die as a result of Soviet intervention. Everyone knows that people died because of the atomic bombs. And that's one of the pervasive problems in the whole critical literature, as I call it, is that basically the bombs are presented, everyone knows it's a cost. Alternatives are presented, and you're never told what the cost is.
Next question is from Carlo Pensales. And were Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombed partly because the symbols of power of Imperial Japan, or the battleships Yamato and Musashi, were they built respectively in those locations to show the Big Six, the Imperial Japan had lost its power, like the reason why they chose these cities?
The question is basically, were they chosen because of some sort of symbolic value that they both had? And the answer to that very shortly is no, not really. What really happened is that when the consideration was finally made as actual targeting of atomic bombs in May and June of 1945, at that point, the Air Force had already been bombing a number of Japanese cities. They looked at a couple of locations that they thought were relatively pristine targets that hadn't been heavily bombed. Hiroshima and actually originally Nagasaki was on the list. It was Kyoto that was advocated by General Groves, who was the head of the Manhattan Project. But Secretary of War Henry Stimson, who'd been to Japan, understood the cultural significance of Kyoto and got Kyoto removed from the target list, and they put Nagasaki in, which was a huge shipbuilding facility. Hiroshima was, in fact, it's sort of, there's no real direct analogy in the US. It was like this enormous Imperial Army mobilization point, training point. It was headquarters of the Second General Army, which was going to command the forces against the invasion of the Olympic invasion, sort of like Rommel's headquarters for Normandy, whatever. It was really what Hiroshima was, among other things. So those were the reasons why they were picked, but primarily because they had not been heavily bombed before, and they wanted to have basically a pristine target to demonstrate the power of the bomb. And this went back to the notion that because the Japanese government seemed to be so unwilling to surrender, it was going to take some terrific shock, totally startling shock, a devastating shock to get them to surrender. And in a way, that was exactly what happened.
Thank you. This comes from Steve Kwasinski, and he's saying that his best 3 books on World War II are Death March by Donald Knox, Prisoners of War by Gavin Dawes, and your book, Downfall. But he wants to know, do you have a date in your mind of when World War II began in the Pacific? And was MacArthur right in allowing the Emperor of Japan to avoid war crimes? So it's basically 2 questions.
Two in one. Okay. Well, first of all, let me comment that he's a man of exquisite taste, as I would say, whatever here. The question of when the war, I call it the Asia-Pacific War rather than the Pacific War, because I think really you have to understand really that war that's going on in China from at least July of 1937 is very much a part of the war, because as historian David Kennedy in his book Freedom from Fear, I think quite adequately said, if you understand how the U.S. got into war with Japan, you can answer it in one word, and that word is China. That's really what it's all about, particularly in 1941. So the war, in my view, is properly viewed as starting in July of 37 in China with sustained combat. I mean, there's huge casualties in China. I mean, you're going to have about 15 million Chinese are going to die. About 3 million of them are combatants, about 12 million are non-combatants. Almost 8 million of them have already died by the time of Pearl Harbor. And there's, the death tolls, if you look at all these other Asian nations, are just astonishing over here. And that's also ties in a way to, okay, what should we have done with Emperor Hirohito? And I've spent a lot of time with this. He's a difficult person to explain to Western audiences because where he sat in the Japanese government constellation doesn't really match up well with how we think about how governments run. He was both a religious figure and he was the supreme leader of Japan. Everything during the war, the Asia-Pacific War, was done in his name. But in fact, because they wanted him as a tremendous symbol, he was basically kept isolated from direct participation in policy, maintained this aura of infallibility, as it were, over here. So, and when you read through the day-by-day stuff, you find, first of all, he's intelligent. Secondly, he spends a lot of time, he gets briefed all the time. He's briefed to his eye teeth about what's going on all the time. He spends a lot of time asking shrewd questions to his military and naval advisors or whatever here. But I and Edward Dray and someone pointed out that, okay, he asks a lot of questions and makes a lot of points that sound like imperial orders. Let's do this, let's do that. But when you look and see what Japan does, no, they don't necessarily. In 1945, he says, well, I think we should launch a new offensive in China. They ain't gonna do that, So you have this very peculiar situation where he is, supposedly everything is done in his name. Everything is under his authority, but in fact, he's not really like a Mussolini or a Hitler. Now, what we do when Japan surrenders is the only guarantee we gave was in the Potsdam Proclamation. And it said that basically after there's been occupation and after we're satisfied that Japan is now peacefully inclined, then the Japanese people will be entitled to select their own form of government, which followed the Atlantic Charter. Churchill and Roosevelt signed adopted in August of 41 as a political basis for fighting the war. So that implied that if they wanted to, they could keep their emperor by a free vote over here, which wasn't good enough for the Japanese leadership during the war. And initially, MacArthur is told that he can work through Japanese officials in sort of this indirect occupation, including the emperor, so long as they're advancing American goals over here. He's also told, don't touch a hair of the emperor's head unless, Washington sanctions it. And as John Dower points out, that when the Japanese officials early in the occupation say, well, we didn't really surrender unconditionally, it was sort of a contractual thing. And as Dower says, they were crisply informed that yes, indeed, it was an unconditional surrender. And then in December 1945, Washington, where the issue of imperial institution and the emperor is very much up in the air, they turn to MacArthur and say, what should we do with the emperor? Okay. A couple of things have happened by that point. First of all, MacArthur has his own ideas about how to run the occupation, in which there's a big role for the emperor, this wedge theory. They're going to use him to show that he's going to lead Japan out of this disaster at implementing American goals. And he's doing that, basically. And the other thing that comes into play at that point is that they're looking at what looks to be a terrific humanitarian disaster in 1946, which is the Japanese are staring at a famine in the summer of 1946 because the 1945 rice crop has collapsed over here. So you have both the fact that the emperor has been facilitating what MacArthur wants to do, and secondly, they're looking at what potentially could be a catastrophe in which maintaining civil order is going to be a huge issue, and the emperor can be very useful there. So these combined effects, I guess, push MacArthur to basically lie, I would say, claims that there's an investigation, the emperor is really not responsible for Pearl Harbor. This is not true, but he does prevail upon Washington to keep the emperor, and he also, in one of his greatest and most noble moments, he convinces Washington that we have to send food to save the Japanese. Now, we've just fought this horrendous war in this white-hot heat of anger, and now we're looking at the Japanese prostrate, about to die literally by the millions, unless we send food. And we send food. We feed 18 million Japanese non-combatants in July, 20 million in August of 1946, 15 million in September of 1946. We feed almost the entire population of Tokyo, which is about 2.5 million, in July and August of 1946. The occupation authorities figure that we save 11 million Japanese lives with that food. Now, the total number of Japanese who died in the whole Asia-Pacific War over 8 years is about 3 million, maybe 3.2 million at most. So our food saves literally more than 3 times as many Japanese as died in the whole Asia-Pacific War. And the emperor plays an important role in that. Now, in my view, with the benefit of distant hindsight, we should have kept the emperor for about 2 years, and then forced him to abdicate and accept war responsibility. And that would have saved a lot of problems we have now. That's the one big mistake I think we really made in handling the emperor.
Thank you. This one's from David Smolar, and he said it was excellent talk. He said his local paper in Los Angeles recognized the 75th anniversary of Hiroshima with a piece by Gar Alperovitz. And he's saying you, Herbert Bix, Hasegawa, Max Hastings have all demolished that argument during the past several decades. And he's wondering why the Alperovitz argument retains currency as a believable explanation of the bomb, using it to influence the Soviets.
Right. Yeah, it's an interesting question. It came at a time, Vietnam and all this doubt or whatever here, it sort of fit with the zeitgeist of that era or whatever here. I know Dr. Alperovitz, and he's a very bright guy. I think he's a zealot over here, and zealots have difficulty sorting out what they want to believe and what the facts are or whatever here. And I think, as your questioner says, a lot of the other people who've written about this, we don't agree with Alperovitz, to say the least. One of the points I would underscore, though, and it really was driven home to me, I was sitting at a conference, and there was a historian from the People's Republic of China there. And the presentation was made that's very much along the lines of Alperovitz and it was all done to the Soviets. And as I've known this historian now for about 4 days, and I kind of read him, and I could see that as the presentation went on, he went from sort of bafflement to he was getting angry. And the reason why he was getting angry is Chinese. And the same thing would happen if you presented that sort of argument to the Vietnamese or the Indonesians or the Koreans or whatever here. That argument basically makes it seem as though the Japanese are the great victim nation, the great victim people of the war. And this drives other Asians who have any knowledge about what that war was like to absolutely, they become extremely angry at the notion, not that we shouldn't recognize the deaths of Japanese, but that the argument basically treats all these other deaths as basically not sharing a common humanity with us. And that's one of the things I'm doing now with the trilogy. I'd like to restore to the notion that basically we count all the dead, the Japanese certainly, but all the other dead, and understand just exactly how horrific the war really was.
And this is from your new book, Tower of Skulls, the first
Right,
of the
right.
three-part trilogy.
Right. And that starts getting into the nitty-gritty of all this stuff, particularly in China. Like I said, I mean, there are probably at least 8 million dead Chinese by Pearl Harbor.
Right.
And that's how terrible the war was.
A few more questions. How did Nagasaki influence the emperor's decision? In your talk, you talked about the first one really, drove it in his mind, but how about Nagasaki? That just reinforced it, or?
My colleague who's written that paper has some very interesting things to say, and I would just briefly summarize and say that the emperor, and when he made that decision in the afternoon of August 8th, had already concluded, for reasons my colleague will get into, is that the U.S. had an arsenal of atomic bombs. And it was not just Hiroshima, it was the notion that we definitely had more than a Hiroshima bomb. Now, with respect to the other parts of the Japanese government and the ruling class, Nagasaki is frequently argued as having been sort of gratuitous, and it wasn't necessary. But if you understand that what the reaction was to Hiroshima, that they're basically sitting back and saying, well, even if they have a bomb, they don't have an arsenal of powerful atomic bombs. And that's what Nagasaki did. The punch 3 days later implied, and it really was a great bluff, we had this huge arsenal of atomic bombs we were prepared to start using right away. And the most vehement advocate for continuing the war minister, General Anami, the war minister, he had gone from being adamant that we shouldn't be deterred by Hiroshima. He starts making arguments after Nagasaki that, well, the Americans have 100 atomic bombs and the next target may be Tokyo. Now that's a hell of an argument for continuing the war, isn't it? To tell that to the rest of the government, and you're the war minister, and you're saying these guys have got 100 atomic bombs, and this will be the next place they're going to drop one. It's just some of this stuff is it's sad, but it is sort of comical at a certain level or whatever here. But that's what it does. The second bomb proved we had an arsenal, and that's what I get back to. That's why the demonstration would never work. Right. If we had offered one bomb, they would have said, "That's very interesting. Let's see you do 4 in a row."
Is there more disagreement today about how and why the war ended than in the past, do you think?
That's a hard question to judge. Actually, one of my colleagues I work with at the World War II Museum, I hate to mention it, the World War II Museum in New Orleans, but he's a teacher at one of the top colleges in the U.S., and he was commenting to me just this last year. He said it's interesting that he's watched students now over several decades. He says it's interesting to see that basically the Alperovitz viewpoint, which was dominant for a while, is now receded or whatever here, and they're a lot more prepared to accept the notion that the bombs were necessary in the war. And the most fascinating story you told me was that after they had done their session that went over the end of the war on the bombs, this student from China comes up to him and says, we don't teach about the atomic bombs the same way in China as you do here. In China, when we teach about the atomic bombs, the whole class gets up and applauds.
Wow. This is an interesting one, and someone who was definitely very much listening to your talk. Can you explain more about the Japanese historian who found out that Hirohito decided to surrender midday on August 8th? What was the reason he decided to surrender? And what is the document supporting this evidence?
Okay. I was sort of reluctant to get into this, but I didn't want to pretend like I didn't know about it over here. We're now looking to get a publisher in a formal academic publication to show this. I've been over the documentation. It's ironically, he told me he started down the path he went because he was going to dispute some of the stuff I said. And as he got into the stuff, he found material that simply had not been looked at. It's a complicated story, but basically when you're dealing with the Japanese archives or whatever here, it's not like they've been free and open from 1945 on. And there's a very important group of records dealing with the imperial household that he got into. It had basically this key evidence. And I would emphasize that there's more than just that one meeting in this discussion of his that's really quite striking as to how, because he convinced me. I mean, I didn't use that story from Togo originally just because I found it congenial. I didn't use it because I didn't find it convincing, because I didn't think it had support. And now I believe it really is well supported, and now I believe it's true. So I couldn't see not mentioning it, but if you simply stand by, I hope within a few months, I would hope, we're going to have the thing published in an English language publication, hopefully here in the States, or certainly in Europe.
Now, several op-ed writers have noted, in fact, 7 of America's 8 five-star officers in 1945 said that the bombs were either military unnecessary or morally reprehensible. Is this statement true, and is it taken out of context?
Yeah, that's an interesting component of the whole dispute. The fact is that prior to Hiroshima, we have no documentary evidence that any of those officers ever said or communicated to Mr. Truman and not to use the bomb at the time. General Marshall did go on record as saying he wanted to make sure that the bomb was dropped on an arsenal at Kokura rather than a city. And interestingly enough, he's the only one who post-war never made some claim about how he opposed the use of the bomb. That's number one. Number two, all of the Navy officers who made that comment, not one of them said they were opposed to the blockade of Japan. And the blockade of Japan was aimed at killing millions of Japanese non-combatants. So the people who point to those kinds of statements, like from Admiral William Leahy, the Truman's chief of staff, who later said that the bombs were barbaric, okay, well, he's entitled to give that opinion after the war, as he did. But the fact is, I couldn't find any statement from Admiral Leahy who found it objectionable that we were going to starve to death millions of Japanese. And the Air Force types also believed that basically they keep firebombing and other bombing of Japanese cities, and that would end the war. The problem with all those statements about how the war would have ended without the atomic bombs is they conveniently don't tell you what the cost of the alternatives were. That's the key thing to remember about all these. Well, we could have ended the war without atomic bombs. Well, what's the cost of that? You'll notice that when they present those arguments, they don't tell you that, well, we really intend, instead of killing 210,000 people with atomic bombs, we'd like to kill multiple millions from starvation. Or we want to kill multiple hundreds of thousands from bombing and starvation to end the war over here. There was active talk about using poison gas against the Japanese. I mean, for God's sake, when you look at all the things that were on the table in 1945, I think Secretary of the War, Henry Stimson, had a nice phrase he used in an article. He said it was the least abhorrent choice. There was no good, clean, easy, obvious choice. Everything had costs. Some of them just had more costs than others, and the atomic bombs had less costs than almost any of the other alternatives I can think of.
There's another question that's related to the blockade question that you're talking about. And were any estimates ever made of Japanese and Allied deaths potentially that might have been caused by that blockade from, say, 6 months to 12 months after the blockade? Like, did they ever do any kind of estimates of how many people could have died?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting point. I get into this in Downfall because there's another twist to this whole thing, and that's that in August of 1945, we had a quick study made of the effects of strategic bombing in Germany to get some lessons to be applied against Japan. And so the two big lessons about what had been effective versus what had been ineffective against Germany were that, number one, knocking out their oil, and number two, knocking out their transportation, especially their rail system, had been crucial and effective targets. So those two lessons are brought back to the Pacific, and there's this new targeting directive that's issued on the 13th of August, 45, which gets lost in all the dust of the end of the war or whatever here. But what those new targeting directives provided was that the bombing campaigns can be prioritizing the rail system. Now, the reason why this is so incredibly ominous for the Japanese is because the Japanese population is concentrated in the southern or western half of Honshu. Literally, about 48% of the total population of Japan. If you drew a line across Honshu, just north of Tokyo, south and west of that would be literally half the population, this tremendous food deficit area. The food was grown outside that, northern Honshu, Kyushu, some from Hokkaido or whatever here. And normally, the Japanese transportation system, unique among industrial nations, was based upon shipping. It was take whatever you had to the nearest ship port put it on some sort of typically small freighter, and move it by sea around to the nearest port near your destination. Well, we've wiped out the shipping. So what's left to move bulk commodities like tons of rice? The rail system. And what are we going to knock out with our air attacks? The rail system over here. And the Japanese rice crop collapses in 1945. So you would have a combination of no rice and no way to move the rice that you do have from places where it's being grown to places where it's needed. So what we're looking at in 1946, when they're facing this famine, as I said, I mean, we're feeding all these Japanese people. Well, if they don't get fed, it was 11 million dead. No one specifically worked out what happens to the Japanese people if we knock out the rail system. But clearly, it's very ominous. And this may have been in the background of one of the famous statements that's sometimes cited about how the Japanese were surrendered by the 1st of November in the strategic bombing survey. This may have been what Nitze, the guy who wrote that may have been what he really was thinking about, but he didn't want to confess that what this was really all about was starving to death millions of Japanese.
Wow. Yes. One of our final questions. Japan killed thousands of Chinese following the Doolittle bombing. Did Japan carry out any such retribution after Hiroshima or Nagasaki?
To the best of my knowledge, no, there was no direct parallel to what happened after the Doolittle raid. One of the things, and certainly in the trilogy I'm working on now, which the first volume, Tower of Skulls, is just out, is what you have to understand. The rape of Nanjing, of course, has become infamous as a specific example of that. And those who have knowledge, like our questioner did, the tremendous savagery of the retribution after the Doolittle raid was another big epic episode of slaughter over here. But just the day-to-day conduct of the Imperial Army across China and the death tolls that are being run up, normally in small numbers, not killing 100,000 people at one time, but just sweeping over areas and just slaughtering Chinese non-combatants. One of the things I talk about in Tower of Skulls, which I had not known about, was that one of the effects of Japan's war in China was to produce this enormous toll of refugees fleeing in terror ahead of the Japanese army. And a scholar, Ron Metter of Oxford, in his book, single best book now on China's war, called Forgotten Ally, puts the number of Chinese refugees at 80 to 100 million people. This is the greatest migration in human history. It's driven by terror, fleeing ahead of the Japanese. And these people are abandoning the elderly and children in flight because they become desperate. If anyone is going to survive, there's wrenching stories of the Chinese just abandoning people to die to escape the Japanese.
Thank you. Why did the U.S. change from a uranium to a plutonium bomb for the second attack?
Well, the decision was really not that we had all these weapons to choose from. It turns out that making fissionable material, which, as I mentioned in the talk, is what makes an atomic bomb. There were two methods that we settled on that we were using, and one was to pursue creating this uranium-based fissionable bomb. But the process of producing that uranium material, fissionable material, was much more difficult, much longer, much more complex, and produced a whole lot less than the plutonium bombs. So we had the one uranium bomb we used at Hiroshima. We would have had probably a second somewhere, maybe December of 45, maybe early 46 or whatever here. But the main pipeline of bombs after Hiroshima was the plutonium bombs.
Thank you. Now, if the war had continued, would not other operations outside of Japan have continued? For example, the British were prepared to execute Operation Zipper, the liberation of Malaya, Operation Mailfish of Singapore. How many tens of thousands do you think would have died in these operations outside of the Japanese home islands?
Well, that's an interesting question, because Zipper in particular, we now know from, after the Japanese put their cards on the table after the war, that Zipper was not looking like a walkover either, It indeed also may have been basically much, much more costly, on the order of an Iwo Jima or an Okinawa, which would hardly commend the invasion of Japan over here. All these operations, when you crunch the numbers, I think Dower in his Embracing Defeat talks about this. In that last year of the war in the Pacific, I think he has something close to 70% of all U.S. casualties occur in that last year. And I know that overall, one stat I do know for a fact is that between the 1st of June 1944 and the end of May 1945, about 64% of all American combat deaths occur in that 1 year span. It's not spread out over 3+ years. It's all concentrated in that period over here. About half the total Marine Corps fatalities for the whole war occur between the beginning of Iwo Jima and the end of Okinawa over here. There's a big issue about finding enough replacements to get ready for the end of the war. So it's the sense is that, as we get closer to Japan, it's becoming more and more costly, which of course partly what the Japanese want to create the image of. They want to make it clear that invading the Japanese home islands is going to be unbelievably bloody.
Okay. And two final questions. What about the Allied POWs and the order to kill them all? Can you address that at all?
Yeah, it's actually, let me approach that this way. One of the issues, the really big issues, quite apart from any specific order to kill all the POWs, the Japanese were running out of food. And the Japanese population was on an extremely slender diet in 1945. And as they got into the fall, who are they going to stop feeding first? So quite apart from official orders to kill POWs or civilian internees, of which they held a large number, those people's fate was really hanging in the balance. Anyone who reads about, for instance, the people at Santo Tomas, who were liberated in January of 45, I mean, their diets had gone to pretty drastic levels, or heading and downward, and they've been left to another 2 or 3 months. I don't think any of them would survive. So quite apart from an order to kill POWs, the likelihood that these POWs and civilian internees are going to die was quite high. I think all the POWs, former POWs I've ever talked to, all were convinced that had it come to it, they would have been killed by their Japanese captors. And there were lots of incidents, episodes where that seems to be clear that even without an official order, umbrella order about everyone, local Japanese commanders reflexively would have decided to kill POWs rather than let them be liberated, like they did at Palawan and places like that. So, I'm not sure. I should add one further point I discovered. Although we were penetrating Japanese radio communications very successfully, we still didn't have enough capacity to read everything that was being sent by radio. And we prioritized the operational messages. And there were whole administrative chain lines or whatever here that we were not penetrating remotely as completely. And I suspect that if an official order was issued, which I think probably was, it would have been sent as an administrative order, not an operational order.
Right.
So we wouldn't have picked it up or whatever here. But I think the belief that the POWs had that they wouldn't have survived or they were going to be directly killed or starved to death, I think was all amply merited.
Thank you. And our final question for this evening, what was General MacArthur's view on the use of the atomic bomb?
After the event, he decided he wanted to state that he was opposed to it. Before the event, no, not really, like the rest of them. And one of the things that I find strange about all these after the event things or whatever here, anybody who was actually looking at the intelligence about Olympic in late July, early August 1945, was going to have very sober thoughts about what an invasion of Japan was going to be like. Now, General MacArthur famously rejected a query from General Marshall about, do you still think this is viable? Saying, I don't believe the intelligence, which I think was really MacArthur's way of actually saying, okay, I'm going to say no now, and then I can always change my mind later and say, well, now I believe the intelligence and do this. That would be classic General MacArthur maneuver. So now and a lot of that dispute by the senior officers, particularly in the Air Force and the Navy, and to a degree from the Army or whatever, it's really tied into the issue of roles and missions and what's going to happen after World War II. What really did the job or whatever here. So the Navy, you'll notice, is very adamantly opposed on a moral basis to atomic weapons until they get atomic weapons. And then all that goes away.
Right.
And the Air Force has the atomic weapons or whatever here, and they're much more sedate about the way the war ended.
Well, we appreciate tonight's presentation. It was informative and a lot of new things that we learned tonight. We can't thank you enough. We wish you all the best on your new book, Tower of Skulls, out by W.W. Norton. And we thank you again, and hopefully we can get you back on here as soon as possible.
Well, thank you, Jim. It's always
Thank
a
you.
pleasure to be with the MacArthur Memorial. And Jim is a absolutely sterling example of an archivist or whatever here. Can't say enough about him, and everyone who does this business knows Jim Zobel.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us.